Yeah, I think that you touched upon very nicely about the connection between Europe and Indo-Pacific in that context. One is that obviously under the war in Ukraine, the China tend to side with Russia. That creates a kind of Russia-China axis, one in Europe and the other one in Asia. So from the NATO perspective, why not? I mean, if they are going to create kind of pseudo alliance partnership, not a formal alliance, but at least kind of partnership in dealing with each other's back, and maybe we should do the same thing. Maybe that's the American or NATO intention, to have this four Indo-Pacific country, the Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So in this case, so what do you think? But this is a not again it's usual coalition of democracy or European Union meets the Asian country. This is a very specific military alliance organization, the NATO, inviting those U.S. ally in the Indo-Pacific. So do you think there's a kind of broader movement towards kind of, if not creating more kind of global alliance network, but at least kind of integration of those two important regions, Europe and Indo-Pacific, into kind of more integrated partnership, even at the military realm? And if that's the case, what do you think? How do you really see that's happening, or who is the main driver? Is the U.S. or NATO, European countries? And my second question is, what then the NATO, the Europeans? Yeah. It is one thing what U.S. wants, so you can talk about your own European perspective. Yeah. But second, that what the European wants from those Asian partners, such as Korea or Japan.
Yes, it is fair to say that the U.S. has really been the main driver behind this process of bringing together the two theaters, right, the Indo-Pacific and Europe. And you have seen for a number of years the US going around European capitals, not only NATO and the EU, but around European capitals, saying, well, the threat that you may feel from Russia, or the growing threat perception that you may feel from China, they come together. You have to treat them as a single entity, as a single threat. And even Europeans who disagree with this, and they say Russia is one thing, China is something different, but I think they do agree that they can be seen as a common challenge from a European perspective, not only American perspective. And that's interesting, because I would argue that without the US having pushed this argument, this may have happened in the future, right? Maybe in 5-10 years' time we would have seen this. But clearly the US accelerated this process, put it on the discussion table. The US was very clear, you should be cooperating with Asian partners. I mean, if you look at the European Union, for example, it has the four strategic partners it has in Asia, right? Korea, Japan, China and India, but China is one of them, Asia more recently, but China is one of them. But increasingly, you see less discussion about China as a partner in some areas, yes, but there's much more discussion, especially about Korea and Japan. And this relates to your second question, which I'll tackle in a second, because one last point to mention about the two theaters coming together, and that is important to understand that cyber has been crucial here. NATO has been very keen on engaging with Asian partners on cyber security issues, and cyber obviously knows no boundaries, right? And we saw recently, we are still under President Moon, when Korea actually became the first Asian country to join the cyber security group that NATO has, but Japan, for example, is also participating in that group, not as a member, but also cooperates with it, right? You have Australia also trying to cooperate with it, right? So I think that also shifted perceptions. When we move to physical threats, right, like the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we start to think about cyber, there are also Europeans that understood we need to cooperate with more Asian partners. As an example, Netherlands, very keen to cooperate with Korea, with Japan, with Singapore on cyber, to name a specific country, not an organization. And this goes back to the other point: what does Europe, not the US, what does Europe want from Asian partners, the Asia Pacific ones? I think that three main things that Europe wants, and one specific to Korea. I'll talk about this in a second, but there are three. One of them, the ideological support, so to speak, and it's very interesting that if you look at NATO, India is excluded, right? And it goes back to the ideological support that Europe wants. From a European perspective, there are countries that have made a choice and are willing to support Europe, for example, in the fight against Russia, but even before they measure the same view about China, right? And other Asian countries, no. And India, for example, has been very clear, wants to be more neutral. Fine from a European perspective, and there is a lot of criticism, but fine if that's your choice. But that means that when it comes to practical cooperation, we'll focus on those countries that now, for example, are imposing sanctions on Russia, that are really supporting Europe in the fight against Russia. But even before them, you saw the focus on these four partners, right? Because it goes back a number of years, and this goes to the second reason, which is capabilities, right? And especially Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand to an extent as well, right? But countries that have capabilities, cyber capabilities, naval capabilities as well, right? Technology, because for NATO now, the competition between East and West, or US and China, goes beyond security, and is very keen, for example, on the safety of supply chains. So you actually need partners, Korea, Japan especially, that are technologically advanced, right? And that can be part of these resilient supply chains. And which also leads to the exclusion of other partners that might be technologically not as advanced, right? And that's the second aspect to understand, that is not only ideology but also the capabilities. And thirdly, it has to be said that from a European perspective is which countries are active at the global level, not only in Europe, but in terms of diplomacy, military as well, of course, but which countries are active, for example, in the United Nations, in the G20, in different settings where Europe interacts with Asia, right? And then you see that Korea, Japan as well, again very active, Australia as well, hence the focus on these countries. That's why, for example, moving beyond NATO for many European countries, Singapore is important as well, right? Because Singapore is also very active, has strong technology, but also very active in diplomacy, for example. And now there's a lot of talk about trying to get closer to Indonesia as well. It goes back to the same point, right? Indonesia is very active as a representative of Southeast Asia. So you have the core partners, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand as well for NATO. And then for Korea specifically, actually, this goes back to Russia's invasion of Crimea, 2014. It's weapons, interestingly. So Korea is the only Asian country actually exporting military equipment to NATO members. Has been exported to Turkey for a long period of time, but after the invasion of Crimea, UK, Estonia, Poland, Norway, there were NATO members that were looking around for to boost their military deterrent against Russia. And when you look at Asia, it's really Korea, the only country, right? So that's interesting because it's a change from the past when Asian countries were importing from Europe, and obviously the US, of course, as well. It's the first time you see an Asian country exporting to NATO members, but it has become even more important, obviously, after the invasion of Ukraine, because now, in the past, the threat from Russia maybe was more theoretical, right? Yes, they had taken over Crimea, but some Europeans, believed it will stop there, and now, obviously, this is not the case, right? And now, you see arms transfers from Korea to Europe that are needed for deterrence, and in some cases, as we know now, Poland, for example, has been transferring arms to Ukraine. So something as simple as fighting a war. Australia has also been sending weapons, it has to be said, but it hasn't started to export yet. But for the case of Korea, I mentioned this in detail because it's becoming more and more important, and it's something that we should consider too.
Yeah, I think your last point is very interesting and important indeed. That, for example, speaking of Asian partners for Europeans, Japan has been a long time partner for many European countries. maybe even centuries of Japan for obvious reasons, its economy and technology in general, and Australia and New Zealand also. I mean, they are located in Asia, but they're almost like Europeans themselves. But Korea was a kind of, in that sense, quite interesting, special, because Korea was not regarded as a kind of such a kind of active member of this international society until recently. Largely, Korea has been very much consumed by the event on the Korean Peninsula or Northeast Asia, but now suddenly Korea's role and its capabilities recognized by many countries in the world, especially in this case the European, and more specifically, yes, I guess the key in this the recent Russian-Ukraine context is that Japan, with all those quite capable military and all that, but due to their own domestic constitution, they cannot sell any or export or do any kind of military exchange with Europeans, whereas South Korea has been quite recently active, right? So, yeah, I think the very sharp, and the result is the sharp increase of South Korean export of those military items to many parts of the world, but especially, yes, as you said, some European countries, and even recently there is more talks going on, I heard also, between Korea and some European NATO members about purchasing South Korean military items such as K9 or tanks or some others. Well, but let's move on to our final topic. That so far we've been talking about Korea going to NATO summit and US Indo-Pacific. But at the end of the day, when it comes to Korea, there are one key issues that always, coming up. That is North Korea, right? But interesting enough, lately there's not much talk about North Korea. That doesn't mean that North Korea suddenly, became very nice and friendly and a good neighbor. But North Korea, indeed, under Kim Jong-un's in the past 6 months, there has been quite active kind of military, provocation with the missile test, including ICBM test. But somehow, it's quite, everybody doesn't talk much about these days, North Korea. So but still there are expectations there might be another nuclear test from Pyongyang. So, but at the same time, it seems like North Korea's with this spread of coronavirus, maybe they're becoming more isolated, and the country is going through some difficult time. So, how would you see the coming months and this year? What will be the North Korea? Because you're obviously the Korea chair, and I believe you also had some experience of meeting and dealing with the North Korean, delegate in Europe. So, how would you see what will happen on the Korean Peninsula, and if North Korea, for example, do another nuclear test? What would be the response from the world, and what should we do, under the circumstances in dealing with these North Korean issues?
It's interesting because I think in Europe we're waiting to see the policy from President Yoon once it is articulated, because I think the perception from most European countries is that whichever policy the South Korean government has, it has to be supported because it's a strategic partner, right? And this comes obviously for the EU, but also for individual European countries, but NATO as well, right? So we're in a wait and see mode, and when the current administration, President Yoon, issues the policy, then I'm sure there will be support about, and also discussions about how to make this strategy work. From my perspective, the discussions that we have with North Koreans have stopped with the pandemic, completely stopped. It has not been possible, as everybody knows, for North Koreans to travel. and the diplomats posted in Europe, they need to receive the instructions from Pyongyang, and this hasn't really happened, right? So from my perspective, at some point North Korea will come out and seek to resume dialogue, because obviously North Koreans see Europe also as a gateway to send a message to the US, to South Korea sometimes as well, but especially to the US, right? They consider that Europe is close to the US, so it can serve for these purposes, right? It's a channel that they have, but this hasn't worked really since the pandemic started. So it has to be restarted. We thought it would before the Omicron variant came by. The North Koreans were showing a willingness to maybe resume discussions. Then Omicron came and then they shut down again. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think eventually Europe will support any sort of dialogue that President Yoon may want to have, because he has indicated, his administration has indicated that they're not closing the door to dialogue, but they may be different from President Moon. So there will be support for this. But I do think that two things have changed. One, North Korea has been one of the very, very, very few countries really siding together with Russia in terms of the votes in the UN Security Council. Even China abstained, for example, right, when these votes came up. And there were 5-6 countries that sided with Russia, and North Korea was one of them. And now there's talk of potentially North Korean workers being sent from a European perspective and Ukraine perspective, the occupied territories in Ukraine by Russia, right? And that's perceived very negatively in Europe, right? Because the perception, well, not even China is really doing this, right? It's North Korea and 3-4 other countries across the world, right? So why is North Korea doing this? This doesn't mean that dialogue with North Korea will stop, I think, from a European perspective, but it does mean another layer of complexity, because Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the occupation of territories, right, in eastern Ukraine is very central to the hearts of Europeans, right? The second thing that could change is, as you said, the nuclear test, because I think in Europe there were high hopes. 2018-19, there was a bit of skepticism towards Trump himself personally, but there were hopes that maybe this works out, and the two Koreas are meeting, and not only the two Koreas, but Kim Jong-un actually met with, went to China, went to Russia. There was even talk potentially back then about a meeting with the late Prime Minister Abe as well. He was saying he was willing to meet, and Europe was thinking, well, is this not only with US, North Korea, other countries in the region, are meeting with Kim Jong-un. He's traveling to Singapore, to Vietnam, and meeting the leaders of the countries. Is there really going to be a change? And I think a nuclear test, in Europe we have kind of forgotten about the test that took place before in 2016-17, right? We kind of forgotten because of the flurry of diplomacy in 2018-19, and I think the summits were perceived very positively, right? So a nuclear test would make many Europeans think, well, here we go again, right? Can we really trust North Korea? Are they really serious about dialogue? And this would mean some European countries, France, Germany, that are a little bit more skeptical about North Korea's behavior. They make it more difficult for them to really go full on in terms of discussions with North Korea. I think, for example, when we had the Hanoi summit, February 2019, Europe was really ready to say, okay, how can we support this process? Even some countries that were skeptical, that traditionally have been skeptical of North Korea, were saying, well, if there is an agreement, the two sides agree that there's going to be some sanctions exemption, you know what, we can support this process with more aid, facilitate dialogue, maybe helping some European countries companies that might want to invest in North Korea. So a nuclear test would put all this in the back burner. But as I said before, if, who knows, suddenly in 2-3 years' time we see another summit between South Korea and North Korea, right? President Yoon says, you know what, I'm going to meet with Kim Jong-un. Then again, Europe would support it. There is no doubt about it. And there are many European countries that, drawing on the European experience, the divisions between East and West during the Cold War, they said, look, we had to engage for decades with communist countries. And Western Germany has spent decades engaging with Eastern Germany. So we know this is not a 1 month, 1 year, even a 10-year process. This is a very long-term process. So if you see a resumption of inter-Korean exchanges, right, and the US getting along better with North Korea, there would be many in Europe who would press for Europe to become involved in the process, and they could still do it at an individual level. It doesn't have to be done by the European Union, right? It could be done by Sweden, Poland, Czech Republic, countries that in the past have been more willing to engage, Finland as well. right? I think they would go back to trying to make more things happen to support the process that may take place between the two Koreas.
Well, I think the world already has too much trouble. There's war in Europe, but also the economy. So many countries are having difficulty. Energy price goes up. Of course, there's a U.S.-China competition in this part of the world. So maybe the last thing we want is another tension on the Korean Peninsula. So far, luckily, it's been a kind of quite stable and quiet. And we really wish, from Korean perspective, we will keep the situation on the Korea in this way, at least for now. But as you said, in that regard, I think there's also much room for Europe and Korea can work together to manage this situation. And if there is another diplomatic kind of opportunity, obviously, Europe could play a very important role. And in that sense, I guess it's really the world is getting smaller, and Korea go to Europe, and maybe Europe can help also South Korea in dealing with North Korea. Thank you so much for your insightful comment and analysis of the situation in the world today. It was very, very enlightening, and I wish you will have a nice and pleasant summer.
Thanks for coming. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.